When it comes to Arknights Endfield, I found myself enjoying character stories a lot more than the main story, and honestly that's not really surprising. The main story, at least right now, still feels like it's finding its footing. It's not bad, but it leans a bit more on the generic side, and it hasn't really reached that point where it fully pulls you in. The character stories, on the other hand, are much more focused. They're smaller, more personal, and they lean heavily into emotional character-driven storytelling, which makes them easier to connect with. So going into Rossi's story, I had a pretty clear expectation. I was expecting something simple, something emotional, something that understands the character and builds a story around that. And for the most part, that's exactly what it delivers. But at the same time, there was one part of it that really didn't work for me. And not in a small way either. It's one of those things that the more you think about it, the more it starts to affect the entire story. Because while Rossi's story gets the character right, there's something about the way the story is built that just doesn't hold up, and that's what I want to talk about. When you look at Rossi as a character, the first thing the story gets right is that it clearly understands what kind of character she is, and more importantly, what kind of story actually fits her. This isn't meant to be a complex or plot-heavy narrative, and it doesn't try to be. Instead, it leans into something much simpler, something slower, and much more focused on a single idea, which in this case is the contrast between who Rossi is as an operator and who she is as a child. Because at the end of the day, despite everything she's capable of, despite the way she carries herself and the role she has already taken on, she is still just a child, even if she doesn't really live like one. She's been trained from a very young age, she knows how to fight, she understands her role within her pack, and there's a certain confidence in the way she talks about that life, as if she has already accepted it completely, and because of that, she doesn't really see herself as missing out on anything. At least that's what she believes. What the story does is place her in a situation where that belief is slowly challenged, not through some dramatic turning point, but through something much more subtle, through her interactions with other children. And this is where the story starts to feel natural. As she spends more time around them, we begin to see a different side of her, one that doesn't really show up when she's acting as an operator. She gets embarrassed, she hesitates, she reacts in ways that feel much more in line with someone her age. Those moments are small, but they matter. They create that contrast between the version of herself she presents to the world and the version of herself that never really had the chance to exist. And the story doesn't force that realization onto her. It lets it happen gradually, which is why it works as well as it does. Her interactions with the protagonist also play into this quite nicely, especially with the way she looks up to them. Because that admiration adds another layer to her behavior. It makes those moments of awkwardness and hesitation feel more genuine, not just as a character trait, but as something that comes naturally from how she sees herself in relation to others. So thematically, the story is very clear about what it wants to do. It's not trying to reinvent anything, it's simply about allowing Rossi to acknowledge and accept that part of herself, the part that was never fully expressed. And for what it is, it's a very endearing approach. This is exactly the kind of storytelling I've been enjoying from Enfield's character stories so far. It's focused, it's personal, and it understands its characters well enough to build something around them without overcomplicating things. Which is why the issue with the story stands out even more. Now, the problem with Rose's story isn't the character and it's not the themes either, it's the plot. More specifically, it's the way the story is structured around that plot. Because the moment you start looking at how everything actually happens, things begin to fall apart pretty quickly. The entire situation starts with something that is, by all accounts, serious. You have an experimental sample that gets stolen, something that is very likely dangerous. Even if the story never fully explains how dangerous it is, we as players know it's a blight sample, so it's not something you're supposed to just leave laying around. And then that same sample ends up in the hands of children. At that point, the objective should be simple. You take it back immediately, no hesitation. But instead of doing that, the story decides to go into a completely different direction. Ant-Man chooses not to take the sample by force, even though they clearly can, and instead decides to go along with the children and play their game, with the idea that they'll just get it back naturally. And this is where things start to feel off, because this isn't just a harmless situation. You have a potentially dangerous object in the hands of kids, and on top of that, you already know that the bone crushers are actively looking for it, which means those children are in danger, real danger. So the decision to just leave the situation as it is and go along with it doesn't really hold up when you think about it. It's not just questionable, it's irresponsible. And the issue isn't just the decision itself, it's what that decision does to the entire tone of the story. From that point onward, you have two completely different things happening at the same time. On one side, you have this light, slow, almost playful narrative focused on children, games, and Rossi slowly opening up. And on the other side, you have a situation that should feel tense, urgent, and potentially dangerous. But those two sides never really connect. The story doesn't adjust its tone to match the stakes, and it doesn't resolve the stakes in a way that justifies the tone. It just keeps going as if nothing is wrong, even when things escalate, even when the bone crushers actually show up and the children are put in direct danger, the story still doesn't fully shift. It continues with that same pacing, the same atmosphere, as if the situation hasn't fundamentally changed, and that creates a disconnect. As a viewer, you can clearly see what's wrong, you can see the risk, you can see the decisions that don't make sense, and once you start noticing that, it becomes very hard to ignore. This is what ultimately hurts the story the most, not because the idea behind it is bad, but because the foundation it's built on doesn't support it. If the goal was to tell a simple emotional story about Rossi reconnecting with her childhood, then the plot didn't need to be this complicated. There were so many other ways to create that setup without introducing something that carries this level of risk and then just not treating it seriously. Because in the end, it feels like the plot exists only to push the character into a specific situation, but not because it naturally leads there. And that's where the story starts to break. Because right now, this feels like a story that almost worked, and that's honestly more frustrating than if it didn't work at all. This is where the real issue with Rossi's story comes from. When you take a step back and look at it as a whole, the problem isn't that the story didn't know what it wanted to do. If anything, it's very clear about that. At its core, this is a story about contrast, about the difference between who Rossi has become and the part of her that never really had the chance to exist. And everything surrounding her character supports that idea quite well. The tone, the interactions, the slower pacing, all of it is designed to create space for that more personal, emotional side of her to come through. And in isolation, that works, but the moment you look at the structure holding that story together, that's where things start to feel off. The plot that is supposed to support that theme ends up doing the exact opposite. Instead of creating a situation that naturally allows Rossi to explore that side of herself, the story introduces a conflict that carries a completely different set of expectations. One that should feel urgent, dangerous, and grounded in real consequences. And then it doesn't follow through on that. So what you end up with is this disconnect between what the story is trying to say and how it chooses to say it. On one side, you have this quiet, character-driven narrative that asks you to slow down, to focus on small moments, on subtle changes, on emotional development. On the other, you have a situation that logically demands urgency, tension, and immediate action, and those two things never fully align. Because when the stakes are high but the story refuses to treat them that way, it creates this strange kind of friction where the emotional core is there, but it's constantly being undermined by the context surrounding it. You can see what the story is aiming for, you can even feel parts of it working, but at the same time there's always something pulling you out of it, and that's really the difference. A strong character story doesn't just have a good theme, it builds everything around that theme in a way that supports it, from the setup to the conflict to the resolution. Here, the theme is solid, the execution around it isn't quite there. And because of that, instead of the story elevating those emotional moments, it ends up holding them back. Not completely, but enough that you notice it. Enough that it stays with you for the wrong reasons. Which is a shame, because with such a strong foundation, this could have been one of the more memorable character stories so far. Instead, it feels like a really good idea that just didn't fully come together. So overall, this ends up being a bit of a strange experience for me. On one hand, I genuinely enjoyed Rose's story for what it is, especially when it focuses purely on her as a character and allows those quieter, more personal moments to take center stage, since that's where the story feels the most natural and the most confident in what it's trying to do. At the same time though, the more I think about it, the harder it becomes to ignore the way the story is actually built around those moments. The issues with its structure aren't just small inconsistencies, They are foundational enough to constantly pull you out of the experience if you pay even a little bit of attention to how everything unfolds, and I think that's where most of my disappointment comes from. Not because the story itself is bad, or because the ideas behind it don't work, but because it feels like it could have reached a much higher level with relatively small adjustments, especially considering how simple the core concept actually is and how well it aligns with Rossi as a character. What makes it even more confusing is that this isn't a case where the story tried to do something overly ambitious and failed to fully deliver on it, but rather one where it introduces elements that complicate things unnecessarily, creating tension and stakes that the narrative itself doesn't seem interested in properly exploring or resolving in a way that makes sense. When you look at it from that perspective, it starts to feel like two different directions that were never fully reconciled, one being a small character-driven story built around emotional growth, and the other being a plot that, by its very nature, should demand urgency, consequence, and a completely different tone. And instead of choosing one and build around it, the story tries to carry both at the same time without fully committing to either. This is why it ends up feeling uneven, because those moments aren't supported by a structure that allows them to fully land the way they should. This is also why it stands out more than it probably should, especially when you consider that, up until now, character stories have been one of Enfield's strongest points, where the writing felt more focused, more intentional, and much more cohesive in a way that it brought everything together. So naturally, going into this one, I expected at least the same level of consistency. Instead, what we get is something that feels like it almost reaches that point, but never quite gets there. Not because it lacks potential, but because it doesn't fully follow through on its own foundation. That being said, I don't think this is something that defines the direction going forward, and if anything, it feels more like a misstep than a pattern. Especially since the most important part, which is the understanding of the character and the ability to build something meaningful around them, is still very much present here. It just needs to be supported by a structure that actually works with it instead of against it. Then these character stories can still easily become one of the strongest parts of Enfield's storytelling going forward. So yeah, that's pretty much where I stand on Rossi's story. I don't think it's a bad story, and I definitely don't regret going through it, because there's still a lot to appreciate in the way it handles her character and the kind of emotional direction it was going for, especially in those quieter moments where it actually lets her feel like a child instead of just an operator. At the same time though, it's also one of those stories that leaves you thinking about what it could have been just as much as what it actually is. And that's always a bit of a mixed feeling, especially when you can clearly see how close it was to coming together. But maybe that's also a good sign, because if the foundation is already there, and if the only thing holding it back is how it's structured, then that's something that can be improved going forward without having to change what already works. And that's really what I'm hoping to see from the next character stories, because this is still the part of Enfield's storytelling that interested me the most. This is where the characters actually get the space to breathe, to feel more personal, and to leave an impact that the main story, at least for now, hasn't quite managed to reach yet. So if they can take what worked here, fix what didn't, and build on the strengths that they already shown, then there's still a lot of potential for these stories to become something really memorable. Anyway, that's just my take on it. I'm actually really curious what you guys thought about Ross's story, especially when it comes to that whole situation with the plot, because I feel like that's the one part where opinions might differ quite a bit. So let me know what you think in the comments. As always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.